Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm Kara, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the Oregon Public Library. And I'm really excited to have Andrea Nolen here with us tonight.
Yes.
She is a historian from Monroe, Wisconsin. And before she began her counterfeiting research, she was a China analyst at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York City, and also a financial intelligence analyst for a London hedge fund. So we're going to be hearing about the counterfeiters from someone in the know. All right, so without any more of my talking, I'll pass it over to Andrea.
Okay, thank you very much. So thanks for coming tonight, guys. I really appreciate a big turnout, and I'm excited to share this because this story has not got a lot of coverage. And as far as I know, it has got no scholarly research done on it since, well, I don't know if you could even call it scholarly. I mean, it was covered in newspapers during the time of Bonelatta's trial in 1870, and it's kind of been sitting on a shelf since then. So I'm in the very privileged position now of being able to share with you that Monroe, Wisconsin, 40 minutes south of here, was the distribution headquarters for a gang of counterfeiters that was sponsored by President Lincoln's Treasury. Okay? It's incredible. The lead counterfeiter was sprung from jail by Salmon Chase when he was still governor of Ohio. He was sent to New York to oversee an industrial-scale counterfeiting effort that faked the bills of a number of banks, but particularly the new national banks and the Treasury banknotes that President Lincoln had just created with the National Currency Act and the National Banking Act. So this counterfeiting enterprise fit hand in glove with Lincoln's attempts to finance the Civil War, at a time when the war was not going very well for Lincoln and his followers. So I would like to, I want to be responsive to what you guys want to hear first. So I've got a couple options. I could talk about Monroe. I could talk about the history of the counterfeiting ring, because these guys didn't just spring out of the ground in Monroe. They had a long history prior to coming to Wisconsin. Or I could talk about the way that the financing, the system that Lincoln put into place to finance the Civil War. So can I have a show of hands? Do you want to hear about Monroe, or the criminals, or the overarching system? All three? Overarching? Okay, yeah. Okay, I'll do overarching, and then we'll get into the criminals, okay? It was an incredible system, okay? The reason that this incident caught my attention to begin with was because out of Monroe, the counterfeiters were faking large denomination bills, like $500 bills, $100 bills, $1,000 bills. Okay, and these are bills that would not have been passable to normal people in the economy at that time. I mean, people paid pennies for their groceries, or you could get a house for like $300-400. You know, a $500 bill is a bill that's going to be used in between banks. So what Lincoln's counterfeiters were doing was designing a counterfeiting system that was supposed to cheat other bankers. All right? And it wasn't the South, okay? He wasn't creating bills as a war measure against the South, as a way of like economic warfare. No, it wasn't that. It was against bankers in the North who weren't entirely on board with Lincoln's program. What would happen would be that, well, with the National Banking Act, what Lincoln decided was that if you wanted to stay in business as a bank in the North during the Civil War, you had to lend him a certain amount of your capital to finance the war effort, all right? And the way that banking worked in the North was that there were state-chartered banks. And one of the ways that these banks made money was to issue their own currency, okay? So this is crazy. If you can imagine this situation, every different bank, as long as it had a state charter, could issue its own bills. You could have the bills of 3 or 4 different banks in circulation in just a small town like Monroe. And of course, the danger there is that if you have a bank that's poorly managed, that currency could become worthless overnight. So there was an incredible amount of instability in our economy in this region. And we had a particular problem up here because we did not have many trustworthy banks. And the problem was so bad, in fact, that in Chicago, the currency that businesses wanted to use was actually an illegal currency issued by an insurance company. All right? We had a dearth of sound bankers. And in order to work around that problem, what bankers would do in our area was to buy assets of southern banks, particularly in Missouri, because the Missouri banking community was unusually well managed. All right? Yes, yeah. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why during the war, one of Lincoln's objectives was to crush that class of financiers in Missouri because they were too valuable for the Southern war effort. Okay? What happened when Lincoln declared his war up here was that many bankers lost valuable securities that had been what they'd used to base their own currencies off of. So you see, what the bankers would do up here would buy these valuable Missouri securities and then issue their own securities based on the Missouri security as like I guess you could call it a standard. Or, don't worry, my Bank of Monroe buck is great because I have one Missouri buck here waiting behind it. Okay? Well, when the war was on, all those Missouri securities were valueless. They couldn't be used in that way anymore. So you had an entire class, an entire industry of bankers up here in the North who were set on edge by Mr. Lincoln's actions. Now, in some cases, if they were radical Republicans, they were on board with President Lincoln anyway. But in other cases, they were like, gee, are we really sure we want to finance this war? I'm not sure this is something I want to get into. And by 1862, when the war wasn't going so well for Mr. Lincoln, those bankers, were a powerful political force that was frightening. That was frightening to the war effort. So what Lincoln did was, it was really smart, devious but smart, okay? He worked with the lead counterfeiting expert out east, a guy called John Thompson, to devise a system where there would be a new currency, okay? Currency that was backed by government debt, all right? He didn't have much gold left. Lincoln didn't have a lot of specie left to pay for the war effort, but he sure had a lot of IOUs, okay? And the genius was, we're going to make a new national currency that is backed by the debt that we issue for the war effort. So it's kind of like a magic money machine, all right? The more you spend, the more securities you have to sell through your national banking system, which then feeds the currency supply, okay? And this comes at a time when, Missouri having stepped off the stage, this comes at a time where a lot of banks were facing cash crises, all right? So it was brilliant, but it was also the beginning of the system that got us into the trouble that we're in now today, where we have, government debt ballooning out of control and no way to really rein it in. You see, so that was what we have today is Lincoln's war financing system moderated it over, many, many decades. So, let's go back to John Thompson, because he was a really interesting guy. He was the publisher of something called Thompson's Banknote Reporter, which alerted businesses all around the country as to which notes were counterfeit and which weren't, all right? And this is a time when almost a third of this money in circulation was counterfeit. So Thompson was a very powerful man, all right? He had experienced a bankruptcy, though, in 1857, although it wasn't the type of bankruptcy you and I would go through. Okay, he built a mansion in the middle of his bankruptcy, and he transferred his assets to his son. Okay, and then he went to work in President Lincoln's cabinet designing the National Banking Act and the National Currency Act. All right, So he really was the architect of the system that allowed Lincoln to finance his war. And for those bankers who were willing to work with Lincoln, which means they were willing to give a third of their assets over to the war effort, Lincoln gave them the privilege then of continuing to issue their own currency, okay? What they would end up having to do would be buy a certain number of the IOUs, of the debt securities that Lincoln would issue, and once they had the appropriate percentage, then they could continue issuing their own currencies. You know, basically, they could continue making money doing that. Now, if they weren't willing to lend Lincoln that 1/3 of their assets, then they lost that privilege of issuing their own currency. So what that did structurally in the northern financial community, there were certain banks that had a tremendous advantage that could really cream it during the war. And then other banks that, for their own reasons, decided not to get involved in the national banking scheme. And they would, nature would take its course eventually with them. And I can tell you now that the banks that are too big to fail, back in 2008, they can all trace their ancestry back to national banks, Lincoln's favored banks. Okay? So really, it was a system where I guess you could say that the financial system of the North was kind of prostituted to finance the Civil War. And it worked. It worked for Lincoln. Of course, you probably, if you were one of the bankers who was on the losing end of that situation, you probably wouldn't say it worked very well. But here we are today. Now, the counterfeiting was a particularly interesting part of this whole financing rig, because there was a credit crunch. When the Southern banks were taken out of the picture, the North had a cash crunch. And so how do you get your favored banks the cash they need in difficult times without increasing inflation? He couldn't just go to the press, the Treasury's presses, and print more money and then rush it off to Monroe if there was a run on the bank in Monroe, because then inflation would increase, and Lincoln's creditors outside the United States would either stop lending him money or say, "Mr. Lincoln, you're managing the economy in a very irresponsible way. We want higher interest rates." And that's not something Lincoln wanted to do. With the counterfeiting, he could get money to his favorite banks without acknowledging that money was in creation. So on paper, inflation looks lower than it actually was in real life, like what he needed to keep all his friends on board, okay? So it was a fantastic scheme, and that's why Chase got involved in it, okay? It wasn't, it was, I guess from the Lincoln's perspective, it was a necessary evil at the time. But of course, it's left us with a financial system that's extremely unstable. There's no other country in the world that gets the privilege of printing the money it pays its debt in. Okay, and that's probably not going to last forever. Okay, so that is the system. That's the system that Lincoln set up. Monroe, the counterfeiters were in Monroe because Monroe was just over the border with Illinois. It had just got a railway, and it was near to Chicago, which was also an important distribution center. Monroe had got the railway from Milwaukee in 1857, and that's the same year that the criminals, Napoleon Bonaparte, came to Monroe from Michigan and started distributing for Chase's industrial counterfeiting outfit out in New York City, okay? Now, prior to this, Bonelatta, he came from a counterfeiting family, generations of counterfeiters. And these guys, they tended to come from New England. And they would move westward as civilization, policing became more rigorous in the New England area and in the South. And it would push them westward. It would push them towards the frontier. And Bonelatta's dad had got busted in Freedom, Michigan the year before, and he decided to move to Monroe. Monroe had just got its railway, which meant we were plugged into the express system. So Latta could send wads of bill all over the country really quickly, Okay, so that was, and it was also kind of Monroe was not in Illinois and not well policed, so it kind of had this extra cover of being out in the boonies. So it was perfect. It was perfect for the crime ring at that time. Now, yes, Monroe was the distribution hub, the headquarters, but an awful lot of that counterfeit currency would be brought down to Chicago and then redistributed out through Chicago too, okay? Latta spent he made 2 trips down to Chicago every month. And this was back when, travel was not easy, And he had to work with Chicago's underworld in order to be able to do that, okay? Chicago's underworld was controlled by something called the Kentucky Colony at this time, all right? Anybody heard of Bertha Palmer? Yeah? Or Potter Palmer, her husband? Okay, Bertha Palmer's dad was the banker for the Kentucky Colony, all right? They had come up from Louisville, Kentucky in 1853, okay? The reason was there had just been a big counterfeiting bust down in Louisville, all right? It was a multi-state effort. Police in Louisville had to go up to Ohio and request the assistance from Ohio detectives to investigate this counterfeiting ring because, they said, our political patronage down here in Louisville will not allow us to investigate these counterfeiters. Okay? And we're not talking, poor people counterfeiting. These were mostly doctors, mostly medical doctors who were organizing this ring. Yes, counterfeiting and medicine, the medical profession, has a strange synergy at this time. Yeah, it was, I talk a little bit about that in the book, but yeah, they were mostly counterfeiters. And when the Ohio police got involved, yes, they were able to break up the ring, okay? But the leaders of the ring were never prosecuted. Okay, the only guy who did any time was a guy called Ransel Lamb. And he was the head engraver for a firm called Rawdon, Wright, Edson, and Hatch. Okay, and they were the gold standard engraving firm of the time. Okay, they did the U.S. postal stamps. They did the legitimate banknotes for most of the respected banks, right? But then after hours, they'd run the presses making fakes. And this doctor ring in Louisville would then distribute it all over the United States, distribute the fakes, okay? Well, 1853, that ring gets busted. Nobody important goes to jail, but out of Louisville, there is a mass exodus of about 12 extremely wealthy families, okay? Bertha Palmer's dad, goes up to Chicago first and buys a huge tract of land, okay? And then these these families move up to Chicago and build interlocking plantation estates on that land, okay? And within 15 years, they control Chicago's services, the politics, the underworld, okay? They become dons of Chicago. And they really don't lose control till 1910, actually. Okay? But what's amazing with the Monroe counterfeiters is they use the same engraving company to fake their bills that the Louisville ring was using 5 years before down in Louisville. Okay? Rawdon, Wright, Edson, and Hatch, after the Louisville thing came undone, it was extremely embarrassing for the management of the company. I mean, the U.S. government trusted them with important engraving work, okay? They needed a rebranding. All right, so the management, the executives retrenched to New York City and renamed the firm the American Banknote Company. Okay, and that is the company that Salmon Chase and the Treasury had making the greenbacks. Okay, and when Salmon Chase sprung Josh Miner from jail in Ohio, he was the counterfeiter that then went up and oversaw that new industrial counterfeiting operation, okay? So basically the same firm that was faking the notes down in Louisville were the ones that Bonelatta and the Chicago people were working with up in Chicago. So it was the same racket, just different locations, all right? And yeah, I mean, the Kentucky colony had it made. They had it made. Now, traditionally, they were Democratic supporting group of families. But for the war, they switched sides and supported President Lincoln, And I wonder why that was. So they had the tiger by the tail, all right? And Bonelatta, the Monroe ring operated well past the end of the Civil War. So we need to bear in mind that, what you might excuse as something necessary for the war effort was carried on far, far longer than the war effort needed. These guys weren't wound up till 1871, during the Grant administration, okay? Yeah, and the reason was for poor President Grant, he inherited some of the scandalous political things that were going on after, during the war and after the fog of war had lifted and people were looking around and wondering, what happened while we were fighting, President Grant had a number of scandals he had to deal with. One of these was the counterfeiting scandal up in Monroe. And it, just like in Louisville, it was very gently wound up, okay? Bonelatta could work in Monroe because our local banker, Arabot Ludlow, was giving him protection, all right? And once the Secret Service actually decided to come up to Monroe and nab these guys, Arabot Ludlow and his investor friends would pay the bail to get Bonelatta and his henchmen out of jail. And they didn't trust the Monroe jails. They had to take them all the way to Janesville, all right? And in fact, the Secret Service had to sneak into town because Monroe was so corrupt they couldn't trust our police not to alert Bonelatta and his friends to get out of there. Uh-huh. And our sheriff immediately skips town after this happens, and his underling is brought up and begins to work with the Secret Service, okay? His home gets burnt down, all right? And the arsonists tell him to stop working with the Treasury officials. So Arabot Ludlow prints in his paper the next morning a congratulatory notice on the insurance company that the sheriff used to insure his home. All right? These were vicious people. They were not joking around. And one of the kind of comic things, I guess you could say about all this, is that the corrupt denizens of Monroe were so used to being sheltered that they really didn't have a good sense of propriety of how to behave when the Secret Service came into town. And so Bonelatta, he actually got arrested twice. He was arrested the first time, sprung him from jail. Monroe guys sprung him from jail. He was re-arrested a few days later, and again, sprung from jail. Bail was paid by eminent Monroe men. And the second time that he came back into Monroe, 2 city councilors paid for the Monroe Bass Band to serenade him as he got off the train. Okay, this is while Treasury officials are still in town investigating. And of course, Arabot Ludlow and his friends are pulling their hair out saying, you guys, you can't do this. We have to keep it on the down low now that the feds are in town. But fortunately, there wasn't a lot of political will in Washington to push any further than Bonelatta. Okay, Bonelatta was the only guy who went away, and Rutherford Hayes, President Hayes, ended up giving him a pardon. So he didn't even do his full sentence. And it's incredible. I mean, I wish I could give you guys estimates of how much money was counterfeited, what sort of economic impact this would have had. But for the same reason nobody went to jail, there just wasn't incentive to investigate how much fake currency actually had gone into circulation. And by this time, President Lincoln had been assassinated. Nobody wanted to turn that rock over. But this has consequences. This whole episode had consequences because it enriched further a very undesirable element down in Chicago. The Kentucky colony, after the war, after they'd switched back to being Democrats, but they were always intermarrying with prominent Republican families, so the Democrat-Republican thing for these people was more of a show. They were all in it for themselves. They were just playing different sides against each other. After the war, when the federal money went away, the Kentucky colony consolidated power in Chicago by controlling gambling, which was the big organized crime undertaking. There was prostitution as well, but gambling was the moneymaker. And to do that, they had a guy called Mike McDonald. All right, and he was the head of the Irish underworld in Chicago. And not only would he oversee and tax all the different gambling operations and then kick back up to the colony men, he would make sure elections were delivered the way they wanted to. See, back then, what would happen is you'd get your neighborhood bully, your neighborhood gangster, who would force everybody living in X, Y, and Z tenement to vote a certain way, okay? And then he'd sell those votes to the next man up, all right? And it went all the way up to Mike McDonald, and Mike could decide then who controlled Chicago. And being mayor of Chicago was a very powerful position. That's how the Kentucky colony kept power, okay? Until important demographic changes happened, all right? At about 1890, there was a huge immigration from the Austro-Hungarian Empire into the Chicago area, okay? And that's everything from Eastern Europe through to Italy, okay? The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a huge empire. Unfortunately, it was also a very corrupt place. And since the 1848 revolutions, the emperor, Franz Joseph, had to keep power by partnering with organized crime elements in rebellious provinces. We're talking Czechoslovakia, we're talking Galicia, southern Poland, we're talking parts of Italy, okay? And what the Habsburgs would do, they were forced to accept a certain amount of democracy in their governance structure. The emperor did not want to do that, but it was forced upon him. So to control these new voting blocks, he would empower local organized crime groups to do basically the same thing Mike McDonald was doing in Chicago, okay? And the consequence of that was that organized crime, and particularly the Galatian gang, became the sort of rulers behind the throne for the Habsburgs. And this was very problematic because as the emperor tried to contain this by expanding the voting franchise, the organized crime groups got more and more vicious in their attempts to keep power. Okay, and what this looked like on the ground was the organized sex trade, the organized sex trade. Okay, and while in Chicago we had gambling, that's what funded politics. Well, in Austria-Hungary, it was sex trafficking, okay? And the gang that really stood out for being able to do this efficiently, really the globe worldwide, was the Galatian gang, the southern Poland organized crime element. And they really took over organized crime in Chicago after the 1890s. And with that change, the Kentucky colony adapted. They took on prostitution as their new moneymaker, and gambling became second place, and Mike McDonald lost his power. Okay? Now, you guys have heard of Al Capone, right? He was a Kentucky colony underling, all right? His boss brought him over to tax the bordellos that funded the Kentucky colony's political machine. Okay, and he worked his way up from there, right? So it was a very persistent, very socially kind of poisonous system that made life for working people in inner city Chicago extremely difficult. And that has consequences, right? If people can't get out of this economic trap that they're in, they start looking for other solutions. And socialism was a solution that appealed to the vast majority of Czech, Austro-Hungarian immigrants that came over to work in Chicago's meat packing factories and the really rough places, right? And this made a problem for the Kentucky colony. They needed some way to undermine this political movement. So what did they do? They looked back to German Europe, where most of these people had come from. Because both the Kaiser and the Austro-Hungarian Emperor, Franz Joseph, had adapted their secret police services to work with the Galatian gang to keep an eye on various political movements. Now, socialism was a problem in Austria-Hungary, but what scared the Habsburgs even more was nationalism, the different nationalisms of the various communities that wanted to break out of the empire and have their own self-determination, Okay, so the Galatian gang were helping the government spy on these nationalists back home. But when they came over to the United States, socialism was what they were supposed to be watching. Okay, now the Kentucky colony, they had a few mayors, okay, but the best known was Carter Harrison III. And he was extremely charismatic. Of course, his own social class liked him very much, but he portrayed himself as a man of the people too. And he liked to, for his own reasons, preserve the German entertainments of, drinking and visiting bordellos for the working classes. He considered himself a patron of the traditional pastimes of the new working class, okay? In reality, what he did was study how the secret services worked back in Austria-Hungary and in the Prussian Empire and adapt those methods for Chicago. Has anybody heard of the Haymarket Affair? Okay, well, that's something where Carter Harrison went in and riled up a bunch of socialist workers and encouraged them to attack police officers, and several police officers were killed. But this turned public opinion against the socialist movement in Chicago then. And it really took it out of the running for a couple of decades. And his friends, Carter Harrison's wealthy friends, were like, oh, well done, Mr. Harrison, you've solved the problem for us. But of course, they didn't. They were just rehashing spy work from the old country to our situation. And it's a really tragic situation for everybody. I mean, not just for the people, the inner city people who had no voice because of the voting machines, the voting systems that were being corrupted, but also for the rest of our area. Because when Chicago fell to organized crime, it had a very negative impact on everyone else around. And if you'll read histories of the 20s and 30s and how Chicago organized crime sort of metastasized up north into Wisconsin, you can get a feeling for the sort of the hardship that people suffered as a result of this. And it really kept the powerful people in power and the lower people low. So organized crime, I don't like to see it glamorized on TV shows and in the movies because it destroyed people's lives, and it continues to do so. And our particular branch of organized crime got its leg up during the Civil War with our Lincoln's Counterfeiters. Now, I don't want to talk for too long. I'm just going to check what my time is. Yeah, I went over. So could I open up for questions, please? Does anyone have any questions? Anything. If you've read the book, yes?
When did banks stop printing their own money?
It was kind of slowly phased out. Yeah, but by the time you had the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, then it was pretty much, a federal privilege, So, but yeah, it was very hard for these banks that weren't in on the National Banking Act to make money. Nature takes its course. And if you don't have something like the FDIC there to, help banking management when they make bad investment decisions, then those banks just go out of business. And given enough time, they kind of just went away. And then you get the situation you have now where there's just, a bunch of really big banks, on top and ever more consolidation below, Hey, I don't know how that's going to work out. Yeah?
First of all, this is like mind-boggling. Thank you for...
Oh, yeah. I'm happy to share it.
I'm curious, how at the time did people even determine if something was counterfeit or not? Like, I'm curious as to the manufacturing of legitimacy.
Yes.
In paper money.
Okay.
Because there's...
Thompson's banknote reporter was one of the big ways. What would happen, you'd have, the board of a bank was tasked with making sure that the plates for the bank's printing presses were secure, And so if somebody came along and they thought, gee, this might be a fake note, they'd go to the bank and present it to the board and say, hey guys, is this, legit? Is this what's coming off your presses? And if there was something wrong about it, then the banking community could establish, okay, the counterfeiters of this bill are using a press that's wrong in the upper right-hand corner. It's got too much down here in the left-hand corner. Everybody look out. We're going to publish it in the Thompson's Banknote Reporter so that everybody knows that these notes with these defects cannot be trusted. You know, and they even had of course they had ways of counterfeiting coins, but they even would counterfeit lumps of gold, you know, like from panning, you know. So I mean, these people were really, they knew how to solve problems. Exactly. So that's one way. Yes, yeah. You know, and there were other ways too. Like for instance, with the Bonelatta's crew, they had the plates a lot of the times. So they didn't have to really worry about something not looking right. But they wouldn't necessarily have the signature of the banking executives that were supposed to sign each note. So if you knew that a note from that time period should not be signed by Mr. Someone from Ohio, then you could say, well, this note is obviously fake because it doesn't have an appropriate signature on it. So there was that sort of thing. There was also some technological innovation with the paper that was being used. They had a new type of paper that was shot through with jute, which meant it was almost like a cloth, but if you looked carefully, there'd be little black fibers in it, and very, you know, impossible to counterfeit, right? However, Bonelatta and his crew knew how to make that paper. Okay, and the only institution that was supposed to know that was the Treasury, and its subsidiary, the American Banknote. I shouldn't say subsidiary. Its contractor, the American Banknote Company. All right, so they had ins, of course, at the very highest level, at the best technology of the time. So, you know, yeah, they were well organized.
Why did anybody use a bank with risks like that?
Well, it was hard. There was a lot of barter. You know, and just because a bank issued a note that said, my Bank of Monroe dollar is worth $1, just like, you know, the National Shoe and Leather Bank of New York is worth $1. People will be like, no, your bank is a wildcat bank somewhere out in the boonies. I can't trust it. You've got to give me 2 of your Monroe dollars, or you can give me 1 of your New York dollars. So the currency was actually trading amongst itself at a discount. So to keep track of this, I mean, it was a great hindrance to trade. It sold a lot of newspapers, because, you know, you had to know the rates at which different notes were being exchanged, right? You know, otherwise you could really end up in trouble.
They made their own market.
Yeah. Yes?
How did someone like my grandmother, who never had, I think, big bills, did she ever have to deal with counterfeit bills?
Oh, yes, they counterfeit. Most counterfeiting, normal counterfeiting was done with the small bills because you could pass them off easily. There was actually a market, okay? Unscrupulous hotel managers, unscrupulous grocers, anybody would buy wads of counterfeit $1 or $2 bills over the mail system, and then give counterfeit in change to their customers. Okay, it was called the green goods game. You know, so that's how it went into circulation.
But it
you know,
never really impacted the person getting the change?
only if they found out, only if when they tried to pass the boat on, there was a more sophisticated person that could say, no, I'm sorry, this is, you know.
Chicago was a center because of transportation.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
spreading it across the country.
Yes. You know, and usually the victims would be, you know, immigrant laborers or other low information people who might not, you know, even understand, you know, what was going on. And of course, by the time they've taken the change, you know, it's too late. So it really was a very vicious, very regressive form of crime, you know. But it was the sort of white-collar crime of its day, all right? You could say that the only thing nearly as profitable that we have now would be drug trafficking. You know, and actually that's kind of what happened. You know, after the war, the Secret Service was largely staffed with personnel who were sympathetic to the Bonelatta counterfeiting ring. Okay? It was almost like the Treasury chose sides in the counterfeiting crime world and put everybody who wasn't part of this, previously Kentucky colony, now Monroe, previously Louisville, now Monroe, counterfeiters out of business, And you could say that the National Banking Act made counterfeiting, if you were organized enough to start your own national bank, you could print your own money. You didn't need to counterfeit anymore, right? So the money wasn't really there. But what happened was drugs kind of came on the scene. By the 1890s, counterfeiting wasn't what the white-collar criminals wanted to do. They wanted to import drugs from Germany, usually, because the German chemists were at the leading edge of isolating the compounds that are active, like in cocaine, and all that stuff. And of course, it was the Austro-Hungarian gangs, the Galatian gang, that were controlling that then, too. So you see, the counterfeiting, the wartime crime was a stepping stone to even larger forms of corruption later. Yeah. Yes?
So, I want to get the $500 bills.
Yes.
That are being used by the government.
Yes.
Okay. They're being used to fund the war. Are they distributing them through the banks and getting bonding through them? What's the...
This appears to have been what happened. In my book, I detail an inspection carried out by a Washington D.C. bank inspector surnamed Meigs. And he goes to one of these correspondent national banks, so a smaller bank out in the boonies, right? And they recently had a credit, a run on the bank. They were out of money. And the First National Bank of the City of New York stepped in to help them. And they were able to get hundreds of thousands of dollars in currency to this little tiny dinky bank out here overnight. And Meigs was like amazed, because never in his professional career as a bank inspector had a loan of money, of currency, paper currency like this, been affected so quickly, so fast, in fact, that it was able to stop a run on the bank. And he said, a system like this is amazing, that they can do this. Now, he also said, I can't figure out how their accounting works at all, but that they can stop the run on the bank, that's great. And of course, what that would have looked like was a whole bunch of high denomination bills being dropped off one night. Now, maybe one of the national banks put their resources on the line, and these were real bills that, somebody would lose their house if they weren't paid back, real money. Maybe that's what was given to this bank. And maybe they just called up Bonelatta, or not called at this time, but, maybe they contacted Bonelatta, exactly, and had him send over.
But again, were these large bills used by the U.S.
Oh, yes. Yeah, they were war financing measures. Yeah. And really, once they came into circulation, they would only be used by the largest banks who were settling accounts in between each other. Yeah. So, that's how that counterfeit got spread. Which was one of the reasons that drew me to this story, because it's economic warfare against your own side, against other northern bankers, against political adversaries rather than combatants. And that's almost like a whole new level of deviousness, but they got away with it. They sure did. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Was Monroe made into did Monroe benefit?
Oh, I think it did. I know you can go there now. Arabut Ludlow built a wonderful mansion on the outskirts of town. It's called the Idle Hour Mansion. Very big, very beautiful. It's actually an event business now, so you can rent out rooms, and they've got a nice restaurant attached and a bar, and they keep it very nicely. It's an asset to the community. But he was able to build that. I think he started it in 1863 or completed it in 1863. So it was this system that was financing that. He gave us our library. The initial library endowment came from Arabut Ludlow. He started up the county fair, which was a bigger deal back then than it is now. I mean, that was the big economic exchange thing. So that was he lent everybody money. which wasn't, totally selfless. But yeah, we did benefit. We did benefit. There were jobs in Monroe. Monroe was an old mining town. Before the counterfeiters came, we were struggling. We were never like Galena. There was never much lead to be pulled out of the ground in Monroe. And when everybody hauled off to California for the gold rush, the town kind of fell on into itself. However, the Arbut Ludlow and his crew around him, who were a very interesting bunch of people. These weren't like normal rich people. They were radicals. They were political radicals. They were radical Republicans. Okay? They also all joined the same church, or at least most of them did, the Universalist church in town. And it's now the Historical Society's building. Okay? Before, the wealthy people in Monroe came from many different denominations, but they all sort of joined Arbut Ludlow's church. Yeah. And the history of the Universalist Church is very interesting because it actually was a movement that got going during the British Civil War. And it was kind of a fusion of Islamic ideas with pietist, German, again, Austria-Hungary, Prussia ideas about everyone will be saved eventually. So no matter what you do during a war, everybody will be saved eventually. And so it was a philosophy that kind of, it did appeal to the criminally minded. Because if you don't have, if there's no guy in the sky keeping track, or I shouldn't say that, if he's going to give everybody an okay eventually anyway, then if we have to do a little shady to make money now, well, that's going to work out, Yeah. So it was a strange group of people, and one of the ladies, there was only one prominent lady who was in Arbut Ludlow's group, and her name was Elmira Humes. And she ran the Whiskey Hotel in town, okay? And that's usually a cover for prostitution this time, okay? And this poor lady, she had a heck of a life. You can read up on it in the book. I mean, she was this daughter of basically some cult followers back in Vermont. Her mother would make herself sick on medical cures. She was a follower of Thomsonian medicine, and she would make herself so sick that little Elmira had to look after the family. So a preteen was looking after a huge family because the parents were so wrapped up in this medicine cult that they were basically too sick to look after the children. And they ended up doing a 4-year odyssey over to Monroe, and some bad stuff happened to Elmira during that time. I mean, as you can imagine, And so when she finally ended up in this mining town, rough mining town, she's got 5 kids, her husband has left her. What do you do? What do you do? And she was smart enough to make a go of it, and by the time Lotta came to town, she had enough capital to give her son-in-law, probably to help him, because he wouldn't have had money from anywhere else at that time. So, this was a really rough and tumble group of people with radical ideas and really not on the same wavelengths as the rest of society, but they were very pro-Lincoln, and they were willing to help with the counterfeiting operation. Yeah. They weren't going to be poor anymore. Yep. Yeah.
What attracted them to Lincoln's side?
Well, they were radical Republicans. And before Lincoln was even a glimmer in anyone's eye, in a glimmer in a Republican's eye, there were a guy called Dr. Johnson had fled Freedom, New York, which is kind of where the Republican Party got started. He had been elected to office there. He'd sold out his constituents. And he was apparently burned in effigy outside one of the government buildings, so he had to get out of town, right? First place he goes to Monroe. Okay? Somehow he knew that he would find politically like-minded people there. And a lot of these wealthy, the Monroe's leading citizens back then, they either came from Vermont or Connecticut, old counterfeiting hot spots. And like I said before, counterfeiting was an intergenerational crime thing. I mean, you couldn't just make the contacts you needed to overnight. And so as policing improved and the families had to move west and spread out, I'm sure that Dr. Johnson just followed that kind of crime trail out to Monroe and knew that this was an environment that would be conducive, you know. And of course, President Lincoln, I mean, he was kind of rough around the edges. You know, he was very lucky, I guess you could say in some respects, because William Seward, you know, the big political man out from New York, which mattered, you know, where the money was really at, had poisoned his career by basically doing the same things that Dr. Johnson had done. People considered him untrustworthy, that if you voted for him, he wouldn't do what he said he'd do. You know, surprise, surprise. You know, and right, and it was disaffected. It was the leading families back out east who had relied on Seward to be their political face, and they realized, look, we need a new guy. We need a guy who doesn't have a history. We need Abraham Lincoln. You know, and you couldn't organize the type of thing that Salmon Chase organized without the backing of incredibly powerful financial interests back in New York at this time. You know, so I mean, the backers of Seward, the backers of Lincoln, they knew what was going on. You know, and besides making this National Banking Act and the National Currency Act, Lincoln kind of repaid his supporters with railroad legislation, okay? Like the whole Union Pacific thing. There were Seward cronies who'd lost power when Seward did, who then moved up over to Chicago and got in on the railroad boom that followed Lincoln's railroad legislation, you know. And part of that whole gig was taking Southern competitors out of the railroad building market. Because before the war, the South was actually really competitive in their railroad building, you know. And they were looking to invest in, you know, the Northwest, up here in the Midwest. You know, they wanted a slice of the action all through the United States. But the robber barons over in New York and the indigenous investors in Chicago weren't in the mood to share. So the war had a lot of different facets, you know, and yeah, railroads and all the goods that, you know, come with that. Because the railroad, the expansion, it wasn't like capitalism, no. It was favored industrialists getting subsidies from the federal government to then build their little, their little empires, you know, through different huge swaths of land, you know. And Lincoln understood that. He understood the political power of being able to dole out that sort of asset. Yeah. And
he was backed from the beginning by the railroads because he broke the riverboatman's thing on the Mississippi. He got the first bridge across the Mississippi.
That evil bridge.
And from then on, the railroad people backed their railroad
Yeah.
lawyer. And that term railroad lawyer literally
from him.
comes from Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, that is
There's a
true.
good one for you.
Yeah, and that bridge was something. That bridge was so brazen because they built it too low so that ships couldn't pass underneath. So in one fell swoop, they cut off a whole bunch of basically Southern, you know, a Southern shipping industry, you know. Yeah, and it was, you know, a lot of legislation and that's a lot of legal wrangling, I should say, and that's where, you know, President Lincoln cut his teeth as a lawyer. Mm-hmm.
Where was this bridge?
Over the Mississippi at the Quad Cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is incredible. And the Board of Trade in Chicago supported that bridge too. I mean, they were really, yeah, I mean, yeah. So I mean, it was all the winds were blowing the right way for President Lincoln in Chicago, you know. And even though the Kentucky colony people came from the South, they didn't consider themselves Southern. You know, they were just kind of in it for themselves. You know, in fact, Bertha Honore, her ancestor was the first ship's captain to open up the Ohio River to trade with New Orleans. So he would have been one of these, you know, or his interests, I guess, would have been influenced by this bridge, you know. And I mean, so it's, you know, they weren't loyal in any way. You know, they just did what worked. Yeah. Until 1910, when there were a variety of things happened, but Bertha Palmer, she was really kind of assumed leadership, or at least the public face of the Kentucky colony, and she got in trouble for a number of reasons, one of which he appears to have embezzled some money that she was responsible for as president of the women's delegation of the Columbian exhibition in 1893. And that sort of came to light, and it was very embarrassing. But then also the Mann Act came into power at that time, which really struck at the heart of the whole human trafficking, the sex trade network that was financing the Kentucky colony by this time. So Bertha had to get out of town. So she went to Florida. Sarasota. No, she got an answer. She didn't found Sarasota like they often say, no. It was being developed well before she came. Her husband's business partners were already down there developing the area. She went down there and, spent her money. Yeah, quite the lady was Bertha Palmer. I've got almost a whole chapter on her, and she was quite, she was very comfortable with the way that she got her money. She was an art collector. She would organize sex entertainments for powerful men visiting Chicago, sort of like an Epstein type thing. Compromising information. Yeah, no, she was quite the character. You can read about her as much as you want, as much as anyone can stomach. But yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions, guys?
Did they actually make this money in Monroe?
No, it was made in New York by the American Banknote Company, but then they'd ship it all the way out to Monroe and redistribute it. And the reason was because it was harder to identify where it came from. Like if it was all coming out of New York, there would be police jurisdictions around it who could start noticing patterns, and that would be an Achilles heel for them. But way out in Monroe, there was hardly any policing. It was going to other areas that weren't as developed as the East Coast or the South. So by the time it came to competent policemen's attention, it had already swapped hands so many times and was just kind of coming in like a cloud, They had thought it through a lot. They thought through how they're going to get rid of it. Yes?
This isn't about any of the characters in the book per se, but could you share with us your aha moment as an author, like when you stumbled? Because you laid this all out for us in the book, but like, could you share with us
there was a
your
moment.
aha
Yeah, and I stand on the shoulders of giants, okay? Because like in Monroe, there are two really good historians, Matt Figge and Tom Mitchell, okay? And Mr. Mitchell had written a review of the press coverage of Bonelatta's trial from 1871. And this was printed in our Historical Society's newsletter. And I read that, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is interesting. The Secret Service came all the way out here, and then I read $500 bills. $100 bills. These large denomination banknotes were being printed. And that's kind of when, like, my background is in finance, so I knew that didn't make any sense for that time period. Yeah, there had to be something really big going on. Yeah. And if it was over the war period, the chances are that it was, war financing were a lot, pretty good. And yeah, so it's really the work of those two men that gave me my up, to start. And Tom, he wasn't interested in pursuing this further. I asked him, I told him, this is weird, this is not right. And he just wasn't interested in going there. So he told me it was okay for, me to take it on. And yeah, 2.5 years later, all this stuff it just snowballed. It was really something. Yeah, it was a ride. It was incredible. Scary at times, but, history is what it is, Fortunately, it was 150 years ago, so. Yeah, I think so. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you. And thank you for coming. Thank you. And if you'd like to buy a copy, I have 2 here. There's some more in my car. $20. So there's a library discount. So thank you again.